Welcome back to Power Play Chronicles, where we uncover the most shocking stories of political revenge, abuse of power, and the incredible justice that follows when corrupt officials pick the wrong targets. I'm your host Marcus, and today's story is absolutely mind-blowing. It's about a corrupt county commissioner who tried to steal a historic family ranch through fraudulent regulations, until she discovered that the simple rancher she was targeting was actually the sitting governor of the state. She was using fake environmental violations and illegal tax assessments to force my 94-year-old grandfather off land that had been in our family since 1873. But what she didn't know was that while I looked like just another concerned grandson visiting the ranch, I was actually the governor with the power to launch state investigations and dismantle her entire corruption network. Let me introduce you to the players in this incredible tale of political justice that unfolded on the windswept plains of Montana, where family legacy met state power in the most dramatic way imaginable. I'm Governor Mike Harrison, though during the events of this story, I was traveling under my birth name Michael Yazza Harrison, using my mother's Crow Nation surname to maintain privacy during family visits. At 43, I've spent the last 15 years in Montana politics, working my way up from state representative to lieutenant governor, and finally winning the governor's mansion 2 years ago on a platform of fighting corruption and protecting family farms. Most people don't recognize me outside of official events, especially when I'm dressed in ranch clothes and driving my personal pickup truck instead of the official state vehicles. I deliberately maintain this anonymity because it allows me to see how government actually affects regular citizens without the usual political theater that surrounds a governor's official visits. My grandfather, Thomas Yazzie, is a 94-year-old Crow elder whose family has operated the Yazza Harrison Ranch for 6 generations. The property encompasses 2,400 acres of some of the most beautiful grazing land in Montana, complete with natural springs, ancient burial grounds, and historic structures that tell the story of both Native American heritage and pioneer settlement. Grandpa Thomas is a living link to Montana's history. He learned ranching from his grandfather, who had worked with the original white settlers to establish peaceful coexistence in the Bighorn Valley. The ranch has survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless economic downturns because it was built on sustainable practices and deep respect for the land. Then there's Commissioner Linda Blackwood, a 48-year-old political operative who moved to Montana from California 3 years ago with plans to modernize rural land management. Linda bought herself a seat on the county commission by spending over $200,000 of outside money on a campaign that promised to bring professional development standards to our rural areas. What she actually brought was a systematic scheme to force longtime ranchers off their land through fraudulent environmental regulations, inflated tax assessments, and bureaucratic harassment designed to make traditional farming and ranching financially impossible. Her inner circle included Planning Director Robert Chang, a former Silicon Valley executive who viewed rural land as untapped development potential, Tax Assessor Margaret Torres, who specialized in finding creative ways to inflate property valuations, Environmental Compliance Officer Patricia Kim, who invented violations that existed nowhere in actual law, and most dangerously, County Attorney David Mills, who used his legal authority to legitimize obviously illegal land seizure schemes. The supporting cast was equally corrupt. Building Inspector James Rodriguez, who condemned structures that were perfectly sound, Water Rights Administrator Susan Davis, who claimed authority over water sources she had no legal jurisdiction to regulate, and Economic Development Director Frank Wilson, who promised outside investors access to available land that wasn't actually for sale. The Yazza Harrison Ranch sits in one of the most beautiful valleys in Montana, surrounded by rolling hills and crossed by Crystal Creek, a spring-fed waterway that has never run dry in recorded history. The main ranch house was built in 1923, but the property includes structures dating back to the 1870s, including a historic barn that was designated as a state landmark in 1987. Grandpa Thomas has always operated the ranch according to traditional Crow practices that emphasize sustainability and environmental stewardship. The grazing patterns rotate to prevent overuse, the water sources are carefully protected, and the wildlife corridors are maintained to support the natural ecosystem. For over a century, the ranch has been completely self-sufficient and environmentally responsible. It provides habitat for elk, deer, and numerous bird species, while also supporting a modest cattle operation that supplies beef to local restaurants and farmers markets. The property has never had a single legitimate environmental violation, tax delinquency, or regulatory compliance issue. Every structure has been properly maintained, every permit has been obtained when required, and every tax bill has been paid promptly and in full. This changed dramatically when Linda Blackwood decided that the Yazoo Harrison Ranch would be perfect for a luxury resort development project backed by her California investment partners. The ranch's location, water rights, and historic character made it potentially worth tens of millions of dollars if it could be converted from agricultural use to commercial development. The first sign of trouble came when Grandpa Thomas received a notice claiming that the ranch's water usage violated recently enacted environmental protection standards. The notice demanded that he immediately reduce cattle numbers by 75% and install expensive monitoring equipment to track water consumption. This was obviously ridiculous. The ranch used less water than it was legally entitled to, and the monitoring requirements didn't apply to agricultural operations under any existing law. But the notice carried official county letterhead and threatened massive fines for non-compliance. When Grandpa called the county office for clarification, he was told that new environmental regulations required comprehensive water management plans for all operations using more than 1,000 gallons per day. The ranch would need to hire approved consultants to develop compliance plans that could cost over $50,000. I was visiting the ranch that weekend and immediately recognized this as a bureaucratic shakedown scheme. No such regulations existed in Montana law, and even if they did, agricultural operations were specifically exempted from most water monitoring requirements. But this was just the beginning. Over the next month, Grandpa received citations for unpermitted livestock operations. The ranch had been operating legally since before permits existed, unauthorized structure modifications, routine maintenance on buildings, and inadequate waste management systems, a septic system that had been inspected and approved just 2 years earlier. Each citation came with demands for immediate compliance and threats of escalating fines. The total cost of addressing all the alleged violations exceeded $200,000, more than the ranch's annual income and enough to force a sale if Grandpa couldn't afford the compliance costs. I started investigating Linda Blackwood's background and discovered that she had run similar schemes in California before moving to Montana. She would target rural properties with development potential, create bureaucratic obstacles that made continued agricultural use financially impossible, then arrange for her investment partners to purchase the land at below-market prices. The scheme was particularly effective against elderly landowners who couldn't afford legal representation or didn't understand their rights. Most victims eventually gave up and sold their properties rather than fight expensive bureaucratic battles they didn't think they could win. But Linda had made a crucial mistake by targeting my grandfather's ranch. As governor, I had access to state resources and legal authority that could expose and shut down her entire operation. More importantly, I had personal motivation to ensure that her corruption network was completely dismantled. I began building a comprehensive case against Linda's schemes, but I needed to be careful about how I proceeded. If I revealed my identity too early, Linda and her associates might destroy evidence or claim that they were being politically persecuted rather than investigated for legitimate crimes. Instead, I decided to work quietly through state agencies to document the full scope of Linda's corruption while appearing to be just a concerned family member helping his grandfather navigate bureaucratic problems. Working with the State Attorney General's office, I arranged for a comprehensive review of Linda's regulatory actions throughout the county. What we discovered was far worse than I had initially suspected. She had been systematically targeting dozens of ranch families with similar harassment campaigns designed to force land sales. The pattern was always the same: identify properties with development potential, create bogus environmental or zoning violations, impose crushing compliance costs, then facilitate sales to outside developers who had been pre-selected to purchase the land at predetermined prices. Over 3 years, Linda's schemes had forced 12 ranch families to sell their properties, transferring over 30,000 acres of prime agricultural land to developers who planned to convert it into luxury subdivisions, golf courses, and commercial developments. The total value of the stolen land exceeded $50 million, with Linda personally receiving over $2 million in consulting fees from developers who benefited from her regulatory manipulation. But the environmental and cultural damage was even more significant. Several of the targeted properties contain historic sites, wildlife habitat, and water sources that were critical to the region's ecological balance. Converting these lands to commercial development would have permanent negative impacts on the entire valley ecosystem. Most personally offensive to me was the discovery that Linda had specifically targeted Native American ranchers, using racist assumptions that they would be less likely to have legal resources or political connections to fight back against bureaucratic harassment. She had forced the sale of 3 properties owned by Crow families, including a ranch that had been continuously operated by the same family since 1881. The loss of these ancestral lands represented not just economic damage, but cultural destruction that could never be fully repaired. I decided that Linda Blackwood needed to learn exactly who she was dealing with, but I wanted the revelation to come at the moment when it would have maximum impact on exposing her corruption network. Working with state investigators, I arranged for a comprehensive audit of Linda's regulatory actions, financial relationships with developers, and compliance with ethics laws governing public officials. The audit was conducted quietly over several months while Linda continued her harassment campaign against my grandfather's ranch. Meanwhile, I documented every fraudulent citation, illegal regulatory demand, and threatening communication that Linda's office sent to the ranch. Each violation of my grandfather's rights was also a violation of state laws governing abuse of public authority. The trap was set when Linda scheduled a mandatory compliance hearing where Grandpa Thomas would be required to explain why his ranch shouldn't be condemned as an environmental hazard that threatened public safety. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the county courthouse, with Linda presiding as the hearing officer. She had stacked the proceedings with her associates who would provide expert testimony about the ranch's alleged violations, while limiting my grandfather's ability to present evidence in his defense. Linda clearly expected this hearing to be the final step in forcing the ranch sale. She had already arranged for a developer to make a generous offer to purchase the property and resolve all regulatory issues, contingent on the hearing's outcome. What she didn't expect was that the simple rancher's grandson who had been asking inconvenient questions about her regulatory authority was actually the governor of Montana, accompanied by the state attorney general and a team of investigators who had been documenting her crimes for months. I arrived at the courthouse dressed in my usual ranch clothes, accompanied by my grandfather and what appeared to be a small group of family supporters. Linda was clearly confident as she opened the hearing by outlining the serious environmental violations that justified immediate action against the ranch. "Mr. Yazzie," she said condescendingly to my grandfather, "your property represents a significant threat to our county's environmental standards. The violations documented by our inspection team require immediate remediation or closure of your agricultural operations." She proceeded to present a series of bogus reports claiming that the ranch was polluting water sources, exceeding livestock capacity limits, and operating structures that didn't meet building codes. Each report was obviously fabricated, but presented with official authority that would have been intimidating to most people. When she finished her presentation, Linda looked smugly satisfied. "Mr. Yazzie, do you have anything to say before we proceed with remediation orders?" My grandfather, who had been quietly listening to the entire proceeding, slowly stood up. "Commissioner Blackwood, I think there's someone you should meet." That's when I stood up and pulled out my official identification. "Commissioner Blackwood, I'm Governor Michael Harrison, and you're under investigation by the state of Montana for corruption, extortion, and abuse of public authority." The color drained from Linda's face as State Attorney General Jennifer Walsh entered the courtroom with a team of investigators and legal staff. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're executing search warrants related to a comprehensive investigation into public corruption in this county." Linda tried to maintain her composure. This is highly irregular. You can't just interrupt official proceedings." "Actually," Attorney General Walsh replied, "we can do exactly that when those proceedings violate state law and constitutional rights. Commissioner Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and violation of civil rights under color of authority." As investigators began securing evidence from the hearing room, I addressed the shocked audience. "For the past 6 months, my office has been investigating systematic corruption in this county government. Commissioner Blackwood has been using fraudulent regulations to force ranch families off their land, then facilitating sales to developers who pay her substantial kickbacks. The evidence we presented was overwhelming. We had documented over 40 cases of regulatory fraud, traced financial payments totaling millions of dollars between Linda's accounts and developer organizations, and recorded conversations where she discussed plans to clear out the old ranches to make room for more profitable land users. But the most damning evidence was Linda's own files, which we had obtained through search warrants executed simultaneously at her office and home. She had maintained detailed records of her corruption schemes, including target lists of properties she planned to seize, financial projections for developer profits, and even racist commentary about Native American landowners. The files revealed that Linda's operation extended far beyond individual property harassment. She had been coordinating with state-level officials to change zoning laws, water regulations, and tax policies to benefit outside developers at the expense of longtime Montana residents. Most shocking of all were communications showing that Linda had been working with organized crime figures from California who specialized in land fraud and development schemes. Their investment partners backing her development projects included individuals with extensive criminal records related to real estate fraud and money laundering. The arrests began immediately. Planning Director Chang was taken into custody at his office, where investigators found evidence that he had been falsifying environmental impact reports to support Linda's regulatory schemes. Tax Assessor Torres was arrested at her home, where searches revealed offshore bank accounts containing over $500,000 in bribes from developers. Environmental Compliance Officer Kim tried to flee when she saw investigators approaching her office, but was arrested at the airport with suitcases full of documents that she had been planning to destroy. County Attorney Mills was found at a local restaurant, apparently celebrating what he thought would be the successful conclusion of the ranch seizure case. The investigation expanded rapidly as more evidence was uncovered. Building Inspector Rodriguez had been condemning sound structures to force expensive renovations that benefited contractors who shared profits with county officials. Water Rights Administrator Davis had been illegally transferring water allocations from agricultural users to commercial developers. Even Economic Development Director Wilson was involved, using his position to provide inside information about land availability and regulatory vulnerabilities to his criminal associates. The trial was a sensation that drew national attention to the problem of rural land fraud and government corruption. Linda and her co-conspirators faced dozens of charges related to conspiracy, extortion, civil rights violations, and organized crime. The prosecution's case was ironclad. In addition to the documentary evidence of systematic fraud, they had recorded conversations, financial records tracing bribes and kickbacks, and testimony from dozens of victims who described identical patterns of regulatory harassment. Linda initially tried to claim that her actions were legitimate regulatory enforcement, but the evidence clearly showed that she had been systematically violating state law for personal financial gain. Her defense collapsed when prosecutors presented recordings of conversations where she discussed specific plans to drive out the Indians and old-timers to make room for development projects. The sentences were severe and sent a clear message about the consequences of public corruption. Linda received 18 years in federal prison for conspiracy and civil rights violations. Her associates received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years depending on their level of involvement in the schemes. But the criminal convictions were only part of the justice Linda faced. The civil lawsuits were equally devastating. Over 30 families joined class action suits seeking damages for the harassment, financial losses, and emotional distress caused by Linda's corruption network. The lawsuits revealed that Linda's schemes had caused over $15 million in damages to ranch families throughout the county. Several families had been forced to sell properties at below-market prices, while others had spent their life savings fighting fraudulent regulatory actions. The county government itself faced bankruptcy as a result of the legal judgments and federal oversight requirements imposed after the corruption investigation. The entire administrative structure had to be rebuilt with new personnel and transparency requirements designed to prevent similar schemes. Most importantly for my family, my grandfather's ranch was completely cleared of all fraudulent violations and received official recognition as a Montana historic landmark. The state provided funding for conservation easements that will protect the property from development pressure forever. The ranch that Linda had tried to steal through corruption became a symbol of successful resistance to land fraud and a model for sustainable agricultural practices that other ranchers throughout the state have adopted. The broader impact of Linda's downfall extended far beyond our county. The investigation revealed that similar corruption schemes were operating in rural areas throughout the West, often targeting Native American communities and elderly landowners who were perceived as easy victims. As a result of our investigation, I was able to sign legislation creating statewide protections against regulatory harassment, establishing clear appeals processes for property owners facing government enforcement actions, and requiring transparency in all land use decisions that affect agricultural operations. The new laws include specific protections for family ranches that have been in continuous operation for more than 50 years, recognition of traditional agricultural practices that predate modern regulations, and requirements that any regulatory changes affecting rural communities must include input from affected landowners. Linda Blackwood is currently serving her sentence at a federal prison in Colorado, where she works in the laundry facility and has reportedly developed an appreciation for honest work. According to recent reports, she spent her time writing letters apologizing to the families whose lives she disrupted through her corruption schemes. The county that she tried to control through fraud and intimidation has recovered and is now thriving under honest leadership that prioritizes supporting agriculture and respecting property rights. Several of the ranches that were nearly lost to her schemes have expanded their operations and are now training the next generation of sustainable farmers. My grandfather, now 97, continues to operate his ranch with the same traditional practices that have sustained it for 6 generations. The springs still run clear, the grasslands are healthy, and the cattle graze peacefully in valleys that have been protected from development pressure forever. The lesson here goes far beyond individual corruption or political revenge. It's about the fundamental principle that public authority exists to serve citizens, not to enrich officials who abuse their positions for personal gain. Linda Blackwood thought she could use government power to steal land from families who had worked and protected it for generations. She assumed that rural residents were unsophisticated and politically powerless, unable to fight back against systematic bureaucratic harassment. What she learned was that family connections, traditional values, and respect for the land create networks of support that extend far beyond what corrupt officials can imagine. The simple rancher she targeted had family throughout Montana's political and legal establishment, all committed to protecting the agricultural heritage that defines our state. She also learned that in a democracy, ultimate authority rests with the people, not with bureaucrats who think they can abuse their positions without consequences. The regulatory power she tried to use as a weapon became the evidence that convicted her of crimes against the citizens she was supposed to serve. Most importantly, this story demonstrates that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. Linda spent years building what she thought was an unbreakable corruption network, but it was destroyed by a grandfather who taught his grandson that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The ranch that she tried to steal through fraud is now more secure than ever, protected by law and defended by a family that includes the governor of Montana. The land that has been sustainably farmed for 150 years will continue to be farmed for the next 150 years, despite the best efforts of corrupt officials who thought they could profit from destroying that heritage. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's using the full power of honest government to ensure that corruption can never again threaten the values and traditions that make rural communities strong. The irony is perfect. Linda Blackwood tried to use government power to steal from my family, but ended up facing the full weight of state authority wielded by someone who truly understands what public service means. Justice may take many forms, but when it comes with the authority of the governor's office and the support of 6 generations of Montana ranchers, it's a force that no amount of corruption can withstand. That's today's episode of Power Play Chronicles. If you enjoyed watching a corrupt commissioner discover she was trying to steal from the governor's family, smash that subscribe button and share your own stories of political justice in the comments. Until next time, remember, public authority is a sacred trust, and there are some families you really don't want to mess with, especially when they include the person who controls the state government.